Hi, I'm Creston, and I'm going to show you how to deploy Ruby on Rails to your own server. This is the second part of the three-part series where we show you how to do that. In this part, we're going to show you how to do your Ruby on Rails server configuration. So, first, let me cover a few assumptions. So, this series is going to look at a single server deployment on Ubuntu 14.04 server. The application stack that we'll be using is Ruby on Rails version 4, nginx for the web server, Unicorn for the Ruby application server, and postgresql for the database server. In addition, we're going to be using Capistrano 3 for deployment. So it's going to take 6 steps to configure your Ruby on Rails server. Please be sure to go ahead and have your server secured first, and you can look at the first video in the series about that. For this part, the first thing we want to do is install necessary software packages such as Postgres, nginx, and different libraries that Ruby and Ruby on Rails needs. Next, we're going to create a new user to deploy our application to. So generally, you want to have a separate user for each application you run on your server. Next, we want to install Ruby, and for that, we're going to be using rbenv. We're going to install and configure PostgresQL. Again, that's our database server. We're going to install and configure nginx, which is our web server. And lastly, we're going to configure Unicorn, which is our Ruby application server. For the first step, installing the necessary software packages, we're going to install Git core, curl, build essential, and Python software properties. So these are some just general packages I tend to like to have on a system that I'm going to be deploying an application to. We're also going to install Node.js. This serves as a JavaScript runtime for Rails. We're going to be installing PostgreSQL, as well as other libraries required by Rails. And lastly, we're going to be installing nginx using a PPA. And this is a separate software repository that nginx manages. Okay, let's get started. The first thing that we want to do, if you have not connected already, go ahead and connect to the server you set up in the previous video. So I'm going to SSH and into the server I created in the last video using the IP address that they gave me. So once I've connected, I'm going to go ahead and paste this command. So again, I like to use aptitude instead of apt-get, and I'm going to install all the different packages that I just mentioned. The only thing missing is nginx, and we need to do that as a separate step because first we need to add the PPA. But in order to add the PPA, you need the Python software properties module right here. So because I'm using sudo, I have to enter my password. Now the installation is going to go pretty quick because I've already installed most of these, but this is the command that you use. Next we're going to add to the apt repository, that's the package manager for Ubuntu, and we're going to add the PPA nginx stable. And we need to go ahead and enter to continue to add that. Now that that's added, we want to update the repository. So do a sudo aptitude update. Once the update is done, we then want to install nginx. So I'm going to do a sudo aptitude confirm yes to install nginx. I've already installed it, but it's going to go through the process of installing it on your system once you've done that. The next step is to set up a new user for our application. So to do that, I'm going to sudo add user deploy, and I'm actually going to specify to disable the password for it. because we're going to be using public key authentication. So once I create it, it's then going to ask me a few other questions. I'll just hit enter to answer the defaults and then say yes. Now that the user has been created, I want to add my public key for Creston to the deploy user's authorized keys. To do that, I'm going to paste a series of commands that will create the .ssh directory and give it the proper permissions. So it's going to make the directory home-deploy.ssh. It's going to change the owner to deploy, change the group to deploy, and set the permissions. Now I'm going to copy the authorized key file from the Creston user to the deploy user. Because as of right now, the Creston user just has one public key under its authorized key. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy that file to the deploy user's authorized keys. Now, if you have multiple users accessing your server, you may just want to append particular keys to the authorized keys of your deploy user. I'm also going to set the proper owner and group for that authorized key by doing these commands. Change the owner to deploy for the authorized key and change the group to deploy. This next step isn't necessary, but I do like to add the deploy group to my user Creston. So I'm going to modify Creston and I'm going to add the group deploy to it. So this will let me access the files easily in the deploy users directory. The last part is to create the directory you want to deploy your application to. So I'm going to paste a series of commands. And then these commands are going to make a directory. It's going to be in the opt directory, www/testapp. I'm going to change the owner to deploy, the group to deploy, and modify the permissions as follows. So this will be the directory where we're going to be deploying our app to. Now you can use a different directory like /var/apps or whatever you prefer. This is just the location I'm going to use now. The next step is to install Ruby. So the first thing we want to do on the server is to change to the deploy user. So I'm going to sudo su-deploy, and that will switch me to the deploy user. So now I'm acting as the deploy user. Now this Ruby installation is very similar to the one that we did for the development workstation. So the first part of this is to git clone rbenv, because we're using rbenv to manage our Ruby versions. Some people don't like using RVM or rbenv in a production environment. They like to install one version of Ruby on a server. But I actually like the flexibility that this gives me to be able to switch them or even have different versions based upon the application. So I'm going to use rbenv. So basically I'm going to git clone the rbenv into the home directory of the deploy user under rbenv. Now we're going to edit our bashrc file, and I'm just going to use nano to do it. Before we place the rbenv configuration at the end of this file in our development workstation, but we actually need to insert it up near the top on the server because a lot of times you're going to be connecting not interactively. And if you're not running interactively, it's not going to do anything. It's going to exit. So we need to make sure that these two statements are at the top of the file. So we're going to export this path and eval this rbenv init statement. So I'll write out the changes and go ahead and exit. Now we want to go ahead and execute the shell to execute those changes. So we'll reload the shell. Now we need to install Ruby build. To do that, we're going to do another git clone from Ruby build, and we're going to store it in a subdirectory of rbenv under plugins Ruby build. Once that's done, we should be able to do an rbenv install L to get a list of available Ruby versions that you can install. So I'm going to go ahead and install 2.1.4. This is the MRI version. So to do that, I'll just do rbenv install 2.1.4. Now I'm going to go ahead and pause the video because it's going to take a while to install. Okay, the installation is complete. Now the next step I want to do is I want to set this version to be the global version for the server, meaning no matter what directory you are in, I want this to be the Ruby version that is the default. The next step is I want to do an rbenv rehash. And what this does is it sets up shims for the different executables in the version of Ruby you want to use. Now we can check the Ruby version by doing rubyv, and we'll see it's Ruby 2.1.4, which is what we expect. For the next step, we need to install Bundler. So Bundler is a Ruby gem. So we will do a gem install Bundler, and we're going to omit the documentation. So after that runs, I'm going to go ahead and do another rbenv rehash. And I'll go ahead and exit out of the deploy user. The next step is to configure postgresql. So we want to assume the user Postgres. So I'm going to do sudo su -postgres. And now I am the Postgres user on the server. And I want to run psql to give me a command prompt in Postgres. I'm now going to create a user or role that matches the deploy user I set up. So I'm going to do create user deploy. Next, I'm going to create a database. So I'm going to create a database, test app, production, and specify the owner to be deploy. Now, I'm going to do this because I'm actually not giving the permissions of deploy to be a super user. I want it to have restricted permissions to the database cluster on this server. As the owner, it can create and delete tables and do a number of things in this database, but it can't affect any other database on the system because it will not have super user rights. Okay, now I'm going to do a /q to exit, and then go ahead and exit. So if you want to test out if it's working, you can assume the deploy user, so become the deploy user, and then do a psql and specify the database to be test app production. And you can see I successfully connected to the test app production database. Because we're using Postgres on a single server where the Ruby on Rails application server and the web server reside, that's all the configuration we need. The next step is to configure nginx, our web server. To do that, the first step, I'm going to remove the default site that nginx installs by default. I'm going to go ahead and remove the symlink from the site's enabled directory using this command. Now, in the site's available directory, I want to create a file for test app. And I'm going to use the nano editor again to do that. Now I've pasted a relatively simple configuration for nginx to work with Unicorn. The first block we have here specifies an upstream block that's going to be for unicorn_test app, so the name of our application. It's going to be able to connect via this socket that is established. For the server block, it's going to listen on port 80 as the default, and I'm going to give it this server name, testapp.rubytreesoftware.com. So I'll direct a CNAME from my domain to be able to look at this application. I'm going to specify the root to be the location that we're going to be installing our application to, and I'll explain a little about this current in public later. This is for configuring the asset pipeline to be able to do serve up gzip assets. This is the try files configuration that says try these static files first before passing it on to this named location Unicorn. And this is the Unicorn block. It basically sets up a proxy to pass to the Unicorn test app socket that we created at the top here. The last few configurations are setting up an error page to for certain errors. Look at our 500 error page, setting a client max body size, as well as changing the keep alive timeout. So I'm going to go ahead and save those changes and go ahead and exit. To learn more about nginx configuration, you can consult nginx.com. To learn more about how nginx can work with Unicorn, you can check this particular web address where they talk about different Unicorn examples, and they actually have an nginx configuration file you can consult. For gzip assets, the configuration that's used for there comes from this rubyonguides.rubyonrails.org website where they talk about the asset pipeline. Now that new nginx site has been created, we actually want to create a symlink from the site's available directory test app to the site's enabled, because you typically only put symlinks in the site's enabled location to enable and disable sites. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And now I'm going to go ahead and say sudo service, so start the service, nginx start. Okay, now that this won't be working fully yet because we still need to do a number of configurations. The next step is to configure Unicorn. The installation of Unicorn and most of its configuration happens in your application. However, the initialization script for Unicorn, I like to go ahead and set up on the server now. So to do that, I'm going to go ahead and start an editor and create a file, etc init.d unicorn test app. Okay, I just pasted the configuration into this file, and most of this can be found at the Unicorn examples under their init script here. But there are a few changes based on how I like to run my servers. So most of the things that you change are at the top here. So as you can see, I'm specifying the application root with the same directory we've been using. Specifying the location of the Unicorn PID. The command that we're going to use to run Unicorn is specified here. And again, most of the configuration happens within the application root. And it's going to be running as our deploy user. So I'm going ahead and save that, and then go ahead and exit. I should mention that most of the configuration that I'm pasting in, you will be able to get if you go to rubytreesoftware.com and look under the courses section. So this will be listed as part of the tutorial. So now we want to set appropriate permissions for this file. So I'm just going to change mode to 755. And then we want to set it up so that Unicorn will run when the server gets rebooted. To do that, we're going to run this command, update-rc.d, our application, and set defaults. Okay, so now Unicorn should start when we reboot our server. And that's it for our server configuration. In the next video, we are going to be covering the changes you need to make for your app, and then we're going to do the full deployment, pushing the code up to the server so you can see it live. Please subscribe to learn more about systems and database administration. Also, if you want to learn more about our course involving Ansible, please join our email list or subscribe. Thanks.